Hi, Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I want to talk about Faramir a little bit, who's one of my favorite characters in the Lord of the Rings. And the reason I want to talk about him is because he kind of highlights some things about Tolkien's stories and Lord of the Rings in particular that some people criticize, but I think are kind of important. And I've touched on some of these things before, but basically the idea is that Faramir in the books, not so much the movie, but in the books, Faramir is a character who is pretty much a pure character. He's a good character. He never really does anything bad. He's not morally conflicted, and he's not morally ambiguous or anything like that. And I think this is really important because a lot of people uh, criticize Tolkien for having an overly simplistic view of good versus evil or something like that, and that he's not realistic. And some people would also criticize the character of Faramir himself and say that it's kind of a flat character because he's not very interesting because he's not morally conflicted. So I kind of want to delve into some of these things and explain why I think Faramir's character is actually very interesting and very complex, very nuanced, but just in a different way, and also explain why I think that's important and why I think that the people who are criticizing that sort of thing are, not really seeing what's there to be seen. So let's get started. So the common criticism of Tolkien is that he has a very unrealistic view of the world in that he's got good people and then he's got bad people and there's really not a whole lot of in between other than, you have Boromir and kind of Denethor. Denethor's not really just a bad guy, but he kind of corrupts himself to a large degree. But for the most part, you have really good characters, really bad characters, and not a lot in between. Well, people usually contrast this with other more modern sorts of fantasy or fiction. One of the more prominent examples these days being Game of Thrones. And in fact, George R.R. Martin, the author of the Game of Thrones series himself, has criticized Tolkien as having too simplistic a view of the real world. But the reason for that is, everybody wants to say that nobody is actually perfect. Nobody actually manages to do the right thing all the time. Everybody does have some kind of moral foibles or at least something that's not really good about their character. And therefore, it's better to have a more realistic representation of what humanity is like in our fiction. So the problem with this view, in my opinion, is twofold. One, Tolkien never really makes it absolutely an issue of total good versus total bad. There's not a character in his universe that we can say just has no flaws. I mean, we don't see any overt flaws in Faramir, for instance, except arguably the fact that he may be a little bit more interested in getting his father's support or love than maybe he should be, given what Denethor's become. But there's nothing in the story that just says Faramir has no flaws. It does say Faramir is a really good character. He's a really good leader who's well loved by his men. He's very wise because he's actually, put a lot of time and effort into studying and, making himself a well-rounded human being. But there's nothing that says he's perfect. Same with Aragorn. I mean, when we see Aragorn, he never seems to do anything that's just obviously wrong, with, again, maybe one exception, when he comes to the Hall of Theoden, and he doesn't in the book. Again, if you haven't read the book and you've only seen the movie, you'll miss out on this. But he refuses to give up his sword because he's actually carrying Anduril at the time, and you can kind of put that down to pride because he's kind of letting his kingly pride get in the way of his what really needs to be done at the moment. But other than these kind of minor things, you don't really get the idea that some of these characters have any serious flaws. But I think that's kind of missing the point because you've got the idea is not that we have to show the flaws of every little flaw that somebody has. It's not necessarily important to the story. So I mean, in Game of Thrones, where everybody has some kind of a serious moral failing, it's like, but do we need to know that in every story just so that we have a, quote, realistic character? Well, I don't think we do. I mean, the whole point of the Lord of the Rings story is that it's a quest. Do you need to see the character flaws of every single person to really make for a good story? I don't think so. So, I mean, I don't really think that it's that important necessarily that we even see any significant flaws in a given person. I'm sure if, Faramir was a real person and we could follow him around for his entire life, we would see that he did have issues in his life and whatnot, and Tolkien would not say that he was perfect, because nobody is perfect. But those things are not important to the story. So the second reason I think that's a problem is also because of the role of fantasy and fiction more broadly, but fantasy in particular, in Tolkien's view, which is also my view as far as for what it's worth. But Tolkien's view of fantasy, and I've touched on this in some previous videos, is that fantasy is kind of supposed to tell us truths about the world, not in a strict one-to-one correspondence type of way, but in a more underlying metaphysical truth type of way. So, I mean, for Tolkien, fantasy is about showing us what is true and good in the more fundamental sense of those words, not about showing us what is true or real in that kind of way. If you want to, one way I kind of like to think of it actually is, if you've ever seen Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, almost at the very beginning of the story, you've got Indiana Jones teaching in his class, and he says, this class is about the search for fact, not truth. If you want to know about truth, the philosophy class is down the hall. That's the kind of truth Tolkien is getting at. He's not getting at truth in the sense of it's true that men are fallen creatures and we have problems. He's getting at truths about good versus evil, truths that are in some ways more important than the conflicted and not so great nature of man. So that's just two reasons off the bat why I think the criticism of Tolkien as having an overly simplistic view are kind of misplaced criticisms. So now let me talk a little bit more specifically about Faramir and his character, and why I think it's actually a much more interesting and complex character than people give it credit for. So one of the things about Faramir's character, and this really gets highlighted by the changes they made in Peter Jackson's movies as compared to the book, is that in the book, he never really even seems to have a temptation to take the ring. I mean, when he finally finds out what Frodo is carrying, he says, "Don't worry, I'm not going to try to take it from you. I'm a man of my word. If I found this thing by the highway, I wouldn't pick it up." And in the book, of course, in the movie rather, he's exactly like every other mere mortal who comes across the ring. He's almost instantly corrupted. The only person in Peter Jackson's movies who really breaks that rule is Aragorn. And even Aragorn, you kind of get a hint, may have kind of struggled for a little bit when he says goodbye to Frodo on Amon Hen right before Boromir gets killed. So it's not entirely clear even that in Peter Jackson's version that Aragorn is really free from this. But the point is, in the book, Faramir is, he tells Frodo at some point, whatever you're carrying, I don't want it, because it clearly causes some problems and whatnot, because at this point he's already had a long conversation with Frodo and picked up on some of the dynamics within the Fellowship that made it clear to him that whatever the thing that Frodo was carrying was a point of contention among the members of the Fellowship. So, and then in the movie, he of course is just like Boromir. He's basically almost instantly corrupted. Not corrupted, that may be the wrong word to use, but he's instantly brought to the point of, okay, I'm going to take that and give it to my father. And you could say that that's motivated by things other than just the corruption in the ring, but the point is he's still doing the wrong thing as the character, and you're like, well, from my point of view, he's kind of ruining his character by doing that. But, from the point of view of the people who think Tolkien's view of the world is overly simplistic, maybe want to see that because it makes Faramir a more complex and real-life character. Well, here's why I have problems with that. First of all, Faramir in the book is a very true-to-life character in the sense that he doesn't just reject the ring out of a sense of goody two-shoesness. You know, he's not a boring character who just does the right thing because it's the right thing. It's not that simple. But like I said, he has this long conversation with Frodo before he ever even finds out what the ring is or, you know, anything about Frodo's quest. So, I mean, he already knows a lot of information on which to base a decision. So what you miss in the movie is all that deliberation. And this is where Tolkien's genius really comes through, because he's showing us not so much a moral internal conflict in Faramir's head, but rather the conflict of, okay, I know I have these moral principles and now I have these facts to go on. How do I resolve all the conflicting needs and desires that, you know, the needs of the Kingdom of Gondor, the needs of me, myself in this moment, my desire to accomplish the right ends, and the needs of Frodo, who is trying to accomplish this very important quest, and the broader needs of, you know, free peoples in Middle-earth. I mean, he's not conflicted in the moral sense of he knows he's not allowed to take the ring and therefore he's not going to. That's not a conflict. The conflict is, given all these things that I know and given all these conflicting needs and desires, what's the best path that I can take? So that's what makes Faramir's character interesting, is the fact that we see a good person who is actually trying to think through a very difficult situation and come up with the right answer. So unlike a lot of other characters in more recent forms of fiction who are the good guy, and I mean, you can see this almost anywhere, video games, movies, books, you name it. If you have a character who is more or less the good guy all the time, they're almost never very interesting because they don't seem to have any difficulty making any decisions. They just seem to, like I said before, do the right thing because it's the right thing. You know, and it's the problem with that view is doing the right thing is not always an obvious choice. It's not always clear what the right thing is, at least from the perspective of the character. From our perspective as a reader or a moviegoer or whatever it is, usually the answer is kind of obvious, because from our more or less omniscient point of view as a person being informed by the narrator, we know what the ultimate good in the story is before any character really could. And so from our perspective, that's why a lot of good characters seem really simple, because it seems like they're just doing the right thing for the right thing, and there's no real complexity to how they come to that decision. Tolkien, being the very good writer that he was, I don't know if he thought this consciously, but it wouldn't surprise me if he did, but realized, at least at some level, even if subconsciously, how you make an interesting character out of a good character is that you show that the good actions they take are not merely basically the result of input-output. You know, it's not like a robotic, you know, this is the action I must take given these circumstances. It actually requires some thinking, some contemplation, some wisdom. You know, it's not just a simple matter of, okay, well, this happened, therefore I do this. There's a little bit more of a thinking process in between the input and output. So that's why I think Faramir's character is actually really interesting, because Tolkien actually shows us a character who is presented with information for the first time that he has to make sense of and make a decision based on that information. And it shows us the thought process that he goes through. And we even know from later parts in the story that he has some internal conflict of his own in some sense, because he knows, based on what the ring is and whatnot, he knows more or less what his father would want in that situation, and he goes against that based on his own judgment and his own wisdom, which of course turns out to be better than Denethor's. So we know that there's some internal conflict with himself, but again, it's not a moral conflict, it's just a conflict of different needs and desires of different people. So that's why I think Faramir's character is a lot more interesting and complex than what most people would give credit for. Now let me finish up by kind of talking about why we need more of these characters in our fiction. So, like I mentioned earlier, we don't really have a lot of characters like Faramir in modern fiction. It's very rare to come across a character who is good and not morally conflicted, and yet also interesting. And you can see that in the popularity of anti-heroes like the Batman type character who's the hero but has some serious issues that he has to kind of work through. You can see that in a lot of other examples of different types of movies out there. You can see that in the Game of Thrones series where there really are no good characters at all. There's some characters who are better than others, but none of them are just the good guy. And I mean, you can even see this in movies like the more recent Superman movies. You've got Man of Steel, and you've got the Batman versus Superman that continues the same character. Superman in that movie seems to be a little bit more morally conflicted in some ways than Superman has traditionally been portrayed. Normally, Superman is the Boy Scout. He's that guy who does the right thing all the time because it's the right thing to do. And that does tend to make Superman's character a little boring. But I think he's boring for reasons other than that I won't get into here. But you very rarely see a character like Faramir who is doing the right thing, and he's doing it for the right reasons, but he's not doing it just as I'm a Boy Scout type thing. And I think we need more people like Faramir in our broader culture and whatnot, because I think it points to something important that we're missing in our culture, and that is the ideal to strive to. I think a lot of people like the idea of an anti-hero or whatever because the complexity of the balancing out the various bad motivations along with the good motivations tends to make for some interesting story elements or plot potential. But I think, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying we shouldn't have Batman or anything like that. I'm saying we need the other character like Faramir too, because if we don't have any of those, then we're missing out on the idea that a person can be good and do the right things for the right reasons and not have to have some kind of not so merit-worthy motivations like revenge on his mind all the time. You don't have to want to have a bad motivation to get you to do the right thing or something like that. And I think that's important, and we need more of that in our culture. There is kind of a little bit of a comeback for that type of character in our culture in very recent movies, and the two examples that I can think of offhand are the Captain America movies, because Captain America himself is pretty much a Boy Scout, but he's not just a Boy Scout. You actually can tell that there's a little bit of thought process going back in the back of his mind. It's not as developed as Faramir's, obviously, which kind of makes sense. I mean, these movies are action movies. They're not meant to be contemplative literature. It's a different medium altogether. But I do think Captain America and especially The Winter Soldier is probably the best example of the movies that have come out so far. Kind of give you an idea of what that kind of character could look like in modern movies. Now, Faramir is a little better in terms of what you would look for in literature, but the point being, we're getting a little bit more of that in modern fiction and culture now than we have for a long time, really. I mean, there's been a long period where you didn't really get a whole lot of good, at least not new characters. You might have had some adaptations and things that, didn't really get you a whole lot of anything interesting because everybody kind of knew where it was going to go. I mean, even the Chronicles of Narnia series, for instance, they made the entire Pevensey family just kind of an infighting bunch of squabbling brats. It was hard to watch. But the other example that I can think of, and this is going to sound weird, is the new live-action version of Cinderella that Disney put out recently. And that sounds really strange because it doesn't seem like a good versus evil movie, but in a way it kind of is. Cinderella, is the character who, despite all the adversity she has to face, it constantly tries to maintain something of an adherence to good principles. Now, in the movie, that's, two very, very simple principles that don't really lead to a lot of complexity, and that's be kind and have courage. If all you did through life was be kind and have courage, that would take you a long way. It's not enough for a full moral framework, but for the purposes of the movie, it works. And the obvious contrast is with the stepmother, who is neither kind nor particularly doesn't really have any reason to be courageous. And so you get the Cinderella character in the movie. She does have hard points where she's having a really hard time living up to those ideals, but it's under the strain of a huge amount of adversity, and so it's not a moral conflict within herself. It's just literally, how do you keep doing it in the face of constantly being beat down? So I think these are two examples where we can actually see interesting characters who are good all the time. They have their hard moments and whatnot, but they don't ever compromise their principles. And I think we can do more of that in our fiction, and I think we do need more of that in our fiction, because we do need characters who are like that to look up to not look up to in the literal sense, obviously, but they give us an ideal to strive for. We need to see people who represent real people being what we in an ideal world want to be. And so I think that's why we need more people like Faramir or Captain America or Cinderella in our fiction, and I hope you agree, because we're really short on them. So that's why I think we need more Faramirs, and how we could actually make some Faramir characters that are more interesting than what people think they are. There are a lot of other elements that I could get into with this, but I want to keep this relatively short. But those are kind of just my basic ideas on why Faramir, and just a general broader sense of a good versus evil simple story in Tolkien's style is important, and why we need to bring some of that back. And I am glad that we are getting a little bit of that back in some more recent movies. I think that's a really important part of what our culture needs, and we need to have more of it. So if you have any particular thoughts on this, please leave a comment below. Please also like and share if you enjoyed the video. If you want to learn more about Tolkien, the worlds he created, and the other things that he wrote, please subscribe, or you can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore. And for now, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.